The presidential retreat on Maryland's Catoctin Mountain may have been established by President Franklin Roosevelt, but it was President Dwight D. Eisenhower who made it a household name. Eisenhower planned to close the Catoctin compound and divest the government of other needless luxuries when he took office in 1953. However, a Justice Department inspection trip to the site led by Attorney General Herbert Brownell so enthralled the AG that he filed a mock petition for executive clemency on its behalf. In defense of his client, Brownell wrote, "Petitioner states that she was convicted without a hearing in the White House, and was sentenced to embarrassment, ignominy, and possible transfer or obliteration." Brownell's petition and a trip by Ike to the camp in May 1953 changed the hideaway's fate. The mountaintop retreat would survive with one significant change. While FDR and President Truman called the compound Shangri-La, Ike renamed it Camp David in honor of his grandson David Eisenhower. The name change rankled Democrats. Representative Michael J. Kerwin of Ohio derisively noted that renaming the camp was the only thing the Eisenhower administration accomplished without Democratic help during the new president's first year in office. There was talk of the name reverting to Shangri-La after Eisenhower's presidency, but President Kennedy vetoed the idea and Camp David it remained. Extensive redecorating and building took place at Camp David on Ike's watch. Picnic tables, an outdoor cooking area, a bomb shelter and a projection booth were added during the remodeling. Perhaps the most prominent new feature was a 3-hole golf course modeled after greens at Augusta National and Burning Tree, two of the president's favorite courses. In addition to golf, Ike also enjoyed oil painting at the expanded retreat. Ike valued Camp David as a place to relax, but he also conducted official business there. Recuperating from a heart attack in late 1955, Eisenhower held cabinet meetings and 4 meetings of the National Security Council at the camp. In July 1957 he flew to Camp David by helicopter as part of the civil defense exercise Operation Alert. Ike was the first president to travel to Camp David by chopper. The helicopter cut the commute from Washington, D.C., down from 2 hours to just 30 minutes. Eisenhower also used Camp David to entertain foreign leaders. Presidents Charles de Gaulle of France, López Mateos of Mexico, and Alberto Lleras of Colombia visited Camp David during the Eisenhower administration. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan arrived at the camp in March 1959 to discuss Soviet actions in Berlin. Macmillan was happy to see his old World War II comrade but came to dread the inconceivably banal, in his words, nightly movies which were usually westerns Ike had already seen several times. Perhaps the most famous head of state visit was made by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in September 1959. Khrushchev was initially suspicious of the meeting site because Camp David was not yet a world-renowned weekend and holiday retreat of American presidents. He thought it sounded like a place where stray dogs were sent to die. Although Eisenhower thought Khrushchev's visit accomplished little in terms of improving international relations, a new phrase entered the political lexicon as a result of the meeting, the spirit of Camp David. Ike later admitted he wasn't sure what the phrase meant. When asked, he remarked, "I must say I have never used it but surmised that it must mean simply that it looks like we can talk together without being mutually abusive." The Soviets had their own use for the phrase. They denounced any Western action they disliked as violating the spirit of Camp David, a sanction they never applied to their own actions. Whatever the true meaning, the phrase has endured as a useful if contested expression of unofficial diplomatic cooperation tinged with cautious optimism. Foreign Affairs would bring President Eisenhower back to Camp David for a 50th and last time in April 1961 when he met President Kennedy there to review the failed Bay of Pigs operation. Eisenhower's many trips up the mountain, combined with his renaming of the compound and his highly publicized use of it for recreation and official business, helped make Camp David synonymous with the modern American presidency and international diplomacy. Camp David is a 125-acre, 51-ha, country retreat for the President of the United States. It is located in the wooded hills of Catoctin Mountain Park, in Frederick County, Maryland, near the towns of Thurmont and Emmitsburg, about 62 miles, 100 kilometers, north-northwest of the national capital city of Washington, D.C. It is code-named Naval Support Facility Thurmont. Technically a military installation, its staffing is primarily provided by the Seabees, Civil Engineer Corps, CEC, the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. Naval construction battalions are tasked with Camp David construction and send detachments as needed. Originally known as Hi-Catoctin, Camp David was built as a retreat for federal government agents and their families by the Works Progress Administration. Construction started in 1935 and was completed in 1938. In 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt converted it to a presidential retreat and renamed it Shangri-La, after the fictional Himalayan paradise. Camp David received its present name in 1953 from President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in honor of his father and his grandson, both named David. The Catoctin Mountain Park does not indicate the location of Camp David on park maps due to privacy and security concerns, although it can be seen through the use of publicly accessible satellite images. Camp David has been used to host private diplomatic meetings with foreign leaders and heads of state since at least World War II. Franklin D. Roosevelt hosted Winston Churchill at Shangri-La in May 1943. During World War II. Dwight Eisenhower held his first cabinet meeting there on November 22, 1955, following hospitalization and convalescence he required after a heart attack suffered in Denver, Colorado, on September 24. Eisenhower met Nikita Khrushchev there for 2 days of discussions in September 1959. John F. Kennedy and his family often enjoyed riding and other recreational activities there, and Kennedy often allowed White House staff and cabinet members to use the retreat when he or his family were not there. Lyndon B. Johnson met with advisors in this setting and hosted both Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt and Canadian Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson there. Richard Nixon was a frequent visitor. He personally directed the construction of a swimming pool and other improvements to Aspen Lodge. Gerald Ford hosted Indonesian President Suharto at Camp David. Jimmy Carter initially favored closing Camp David in order to save money, but once he visited the retreat, he decided to keep it. Carter brokered the Camp David Accords there in September 1978 between Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem. Ronald Reagan visited the retreat more than any other president. In 1984, Reagan hosted British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Reagan restored the nature trails that Nixon paved over so he could horseback ride at Camp David. George H. W. Bush's daughter, Dorothy Bush Koch, was married there in 1992, in the first wedding held at Camp David. During his tenure as president, Bill Clinton spent every Thanksgiving at Camp David with his family. In July 2000, he hosted the 2000 Camp David summit negotiations between Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat there. In February 2001, George W. Bush held his first meeting with a European leader, UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, at Camp David, to discuss missile defense, Iraq, and NATO. After the September 11 attacks, Bush held a cabinet meeting at Camp David to prepare the United States invasion of Afghanistan. During his 2 terms in office, Bush visited Camp David 149 times, for a total of 487 days, for hosting foreign visitors as well as a personal retreat. He met Blair there 4 times. Among the numerous other foreign leaders he hosted at Camp David were Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Musharraf of Pakistan in 2003, Danish Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen in June 2006 and British Prime Minister Gordon Brown in 2007. Barack Obama chose Camp David to host the 38th G8 summit in 2012. President Obama also hosted Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev at Camp David, as well as the GCC summit there in 2015. Donald Trump hosted Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Speaker of the House Paul Ryan at Camp David while the Republican Party prepared to defend both houses of Congress in the 2018 midterm elections. Trump also planned to meet with the Taliban at Camp David to negotiate a peace agreement in 2019, but refrained after a suicide bombing in Kabul killed U.S. troops. The 46th G7 summit was to be held at Camp David on June 10 to 12, 2020, but was cancelled due to health concerns during what was at the time considered the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Joe Biden hosted the U.S., Japan, Korea summit with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol at Camp David in August 2023, resulting in the declaration of the Camp David Principles on trilateral relations between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. To be able to play his favorite sport, President Eisenhower had golf course architect Robert Trent Jones design a practice golf facility at Camp David. Around 1954, Jones built one golf hole, a par-3 with 4 different tees. Eisenhower added a 250-yard, 230 m, driving range near the helicopter landing zone. On July 2, 2011, an F-15 intercepted a civilian aircraft approximately 6 miles, 10 kilometers, from Camp David, when President Obama was in the residence. The two-seater, which was out of radio communication, was escorted to nearby Hagerstown, Maryland, without incident. On July 10, 2011, an F-15 intercepted another small plane near Camp David when Obama was again in the residence. A total of 3 were intercepted that weekend. Thank you for watching this video.